is LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Wednesday's edition of Cross Question. It's your chance to put your questions to our panel. Let me tell you who I've got with me in the studio tonight. We have the political YouTuber Maya Tusi. We have Dr. Charlotte Proudman, human rights barrister, Michael Brown, political commentator, former Conservative MP and Whip, and Munira Wilson, the Liberal Democrat MP for Twickenham and the party's education spokesperson. You know the number by now, 0345 6060 973. The text number is 84850. And you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Lovely text to start off with. Someone saying, anonymous obviously, Iain, you're a danger to the public good and shouldn't have a voice to share your idiotic thoughts. Unluckily for you, I have a microphone and you don't, mate. Right, let's get on with the first question. It's Simon in Southampton. Hello, Simon.
Evening, Iain. Nice to speak to you again, even though we don't see eye to eye. Incidentally, before I say my question, can I just say the best performance of the whole conference was Steve Bray. Absolutely outstanding. Oh. Good work.
Right, now, fade him out.
My question is this. I'm a humble taxi driver, and since the pandemic, I've had to supplement my income with universal credit. Does that make me a lesser person or my life less important than somebody who's going to be out there creating growth?
Well, I suppose the glib answer to that was provided by Jake Berry, the Conservative Party chairman earlier. He said, well, if you want to improve, get a better job, which I thought was a pretty astonishing thing for a Conservative Party chairman to say, but there we are. Munira Wilson.
Hi, Simon. No, you're not less important at all. You're extremely important. And I think I heard today that Iain was in a taxi, weren't you, from Birmingham to London?
Oh, so here we go.
Taxi.
What's said off air stays on.
Sorry. Taxi drivers are really important to the economy.
It's Mick Lynch's fault that...
yeah, well, I'm sure we'll get onto that.
Evil twin.
I am really concerned about the fact that people who are claiming benefits are being talked down in the way that they are and potentially having their benefits not uprated in line with inflation when we're in a cost of living crisis. I was appalled by Suella Braverman's comments about benefits claimants yesterday.
What did she say?
Well, she was essentially saying there's millions of people out there who could be in work and aren't in work. And the reality is, like Simon, there are many people in vital jobs, whether you're a taxi driver like Simon or whether indeed you're a care worker who's earning poverty wages in such an important sector where we've got such a shortage of people.
But there are lots of people out there who aren't in work, who could be, but choose not to be.
Well,
she said a lot of appalling things yesterday, I think, but on that front, she does have a point.
But a lot of the people who aren't in work aren't necessarily on benefits. So we know that through the pandemic, there's lots of, say, people older who took early retirement and have chosen to come out of the workforce. But what we're talking about here is the benefits and the fact that there's now an internal row in the Tory party about benefits uprating. If you want to reduce the benefits bill, look at something like housing benefit. I was talking to somebody in my constituency surgery just a few weeks ago who's really struggling. She was in an abusive relationship. She's managed to get out of that. She's trying to retrain. She's having to skip taking her medication, which she can't afford to pay for, so she can afford to pay for her daughter to have meals at college. Now, she's trying to make a better life for herself by retraining. She's struggling in the private sector. She needs housing benefit. If we had more social housing, then you wouldn't need so much in terms of housing benefit. If we had a health service that was functioning, you'd probably have fewer people off sick. And you've got to appreciate that there are people out there, whether they've got a disability, whether they've got caring responsibilities, who can't necessarily get out there and work. Or we have very low-paying jobs, for instance, in the care sector, or as Simon has said, as a taxi driver, who are out there working extremely hard, working very long shifts. I know of a mother in my constituency who's very well qualified from abroad, can't get a job in the sector that she trained in, and is out there being a care worker with 2 young children who she's struggling to look after, and leaving them at home and going out 7 days a week, working very long shifts in the care sector. I think these people are absolutely critical to growth, and to denigrate them in the way that we've heard the Tories doing this week is just appalling.
Just to clarify what Suella Braverman actually said, she said that a benefit street culture still exists. She said we have a lot of carrots to get people into work, but we've got to add more conditionality and a bit more stick. We're not a cruel party, and we're here to support people through tough times. Maya Tusi.
So I think this is the problem with the debate. As a kind of a supporter of the economic right, the problem that this side usually has, and the Tory party are showing it again, is there is a legitimate debate to have, say, well, is it going to work or not? Social democracy versus libertarianism, neoliberalism, all these words. But when the Tories are messing up their actual arguments, and the debate is turning into, well, is this actually even human or not? Are you doing it because you hate poor people or not? Then you'd be not even debating if it's going to work or not. So right now, when you have Jake Berry saying something like that, about get a better job, or indications from even Suella saying that there are a lot of people on benefits. To be fair, employment rate is quite high now. Unemployment rate is very down. There's a massive cost of living crisis, obviously, but there are not many people comparing to the 80s or 90s. And the Tories are losing the argument because when that branding of the kind of toxic Tories kind of coming out, it isn't really about the policy, it's about the rhetoric, and they're losing it already by just coming out to say, well, basically just man up and be confident. Because I want to be able, to my side, the economic liberal side, to actually come and explain to the world that if you implement it properly, growth, it could work. You can still have safety net, and you can still do this and do that. But we're not even getting close to that debate, because it's about, are you the goodie or baddie? If these politicians do they care about poor people? These politicians, is it just for the bankers bonuses and all that debate? Why are we going backwards? And again, it's the fault of not just the mainstream media, but also actually the Tory politicians who are bad at selling their own product.
Well, they've certainly been quite bad this week.
Very bad.
Charlotte Proudman.
I think that the nasty party is back when it comes to the Conservatives. I think it's incredibly sad to hear Simon even suggest that he could be considered to be a lesser person because he's not earning perhaps as much as other people, such as bankers, who are clearly seen as perhaps providing more benefits to the economy than people such as Simon. And yet he's doing, no doubt, a valuable job, as indeed are many other people who are contributing to the economy. And I think a lot of this is a distraction, from the Conservative Party. It's focusing on the individual as if the individual is at fault somehow. They should be working harder, getting a better paid job, rather than recognising the dire financial time that we're in at the moment and the really severe consequences that people are going to be suffering this winter. I mean, not only have we seen rising demand when it comes to food banks, but of course now we have heat banks as well, where people are having to go to places just to keep warm, and those are going to be operated by councils and other agencies. We shouldn't be living in Dickensian times in 2022, and this is just nothing more than deflection from the Conservative Party. And of course, I just want to add, benefits should be going up with inflation.
They would point out that the situation is happening all over Europe and most of the developed world, that it's not just our country that's being affected, and that the reason this is happening is because of the increase in energy costs, because of the war in Ukraine. And it's a fair point to make, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not suggesting at all that somehow the UK is different to other parts of the EU. I think the issue, though, is the rhetoric and the fact that that's not necessarily reflected when people are being told, well, why don't you go out and get a better job, or why don't we get more people who are on benefits back into work, without recognising how difficult actually that is. And people are working full-time jobs and are still using food banks and are still reliant upon universal credit. Nobody should be left in that degrading position when they're often working some 70-hour weeks. And I represent many of those people who are suffering as a result.
I think you have an interesting point about the use of language here, because I kept hearing this word handout. Yeah. Now, to me, a handout is something very different from a benefit. A benefit is something that you're entitled to under the law. A handout is almost a sort of charitable thing, isn't it? It's not a sort of government thing.
Yeah.
Michael Brown, let's go back to Simon's question. He says, well, let's just read it. It says, as someone who's had to supplement my income with universal credit, am I less important than someone who wants to get out there and stimulate growth?
Well, he's absolutely vital to the economy. The whole point of the original Iain Duncan Smith introduction of universal credit was precisely to ensure that those people who were working but needed to be encouraged to work by an extra top-up benefit, universal credit, which I support, it's doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And he must be utterly furious at the comments by a cabinet minister who should know better. The subplot of all of this is that they are, we think, trying to get away with not indexing according to inflation universal credit and the other benefits.
Well,
and that would be disgraceful.
Some cabinet ministers aren't, it seems.
Well, I think it's I think it's appalling that first of all the cabinet doesn't know what it's doing. You've got disunity amongst the cabinet. You've got Jake Berry.
We might come on to that. So let's
okay, fine. Well, let's stick to Simon. 40% of universal credit goes to people like Simon who are doing a full day's work, ensuring that those of us that want to get taxes are able to do so.
Which at the moment, frankly, in most areas you can't.
Well, that's probably more to do in London with Sadiq Khan than anybody else, but we'll park that for a moment. The blunt truth is, universal credit is a Conservative benefit of which they ought to have been proud, and here they are trashing their own policy, and it is a benefit precisely to assist people, to encourage them to go to work.
I mean, Nira, what do you make of the fact that there are three people in this studio who would self-describe as being on the right of British politics, maybe not signed up Conservatives anymore, but relatively friendly to them ideologically, and yet all three of us, all we've done is be critical?
I think that tells you all you need to know about the state of the Tory party and why their vote is collapsing. I mean, traditional Tory voters are leaving the party in their droves. We've seen that in recent by-elections where, of course, Liberal Democrats have managed to win safe Conservative seats. And I hear that out on the doors in my own constituency where, Conservative-leaning voters say, we can't vote for this shower. And that just tells you that you've got, three, as you say, right-leaning people on this panel who are also criticising their policies. I mean,
I should say I'm not on the panel, but
I was just going to say, I'm not right-leaning, so I know.
Three around this table.
Three around the table.
But I don't know if we're going to come on to growth in more detail.
Well, I think we probably are. So let's park that one. But not for the first time. A tweeter, Roger, points out that I owe Mick Lynch an apology because apparently today's strikes weren't the RMT, they were ASLEF. So Mick Whelan, it's all your fault. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
17 minutes past 8. With me on the panel, Munira Wilson, the Liberal Democrat MP for Twickenham, and she speaks for the party on education matters. Michael Brown, political commentator and former Conservative MP, who was on my All Talk podcast last week. So if you want to listen to that, it's a very entertaining chat we had, wasn't it?
It was delightful.
I thought it was anyway. Dr. Charlotte Proudman is a human rights barrister. She specialises in cases relating to violence against women and girls. Lots of those cases in the news at the moment, aren't there? Really horrible, horrible cases. And Maya Tusi is a political YouTuber. Right, let's go to the next call. It's Jay in St Ives. Hello, Jay.
Hello, hi, good evening. I wanted to ask a question. Has Tory party reached its sell-by date?
Just expand on that. Why do you ask the question?
It's because it seems to me they don't stimulate. They don't they lost. I think they lost direction. There's no energy. They just infighting, and there's no innovation anymore. And it's just and they reached to the. It's just
They've just had it, basically. I think that's what we mean. Now, Michael Brown, are there analogies to be drawn here to maybe your last few years in Parliament in the 1990s when the major government seemed to run out of steam after a long time in power?
There are some. First of all, I would say to Jay that the Tory party at the moment is past its sell-by date. But
so cruel.
To be serious for a moment, and I regret that.
Well, I thought you were being serious.
I regret that. There are parallels. I think this is worse. I've got a bet on with a friend of mine that the general election result for the Tories in 1997 will be seen as a triumph on the morning after the next election. Wow. It can be a lot worse. And I was on a programme last night doing the paper review with John Curtis and reading the comments that he's made in the press today and what he hinted last night. It's going to be possibly a whole lot worse than May the 1st, 1997. The parallels are very, very similar, though, in this regard. There are dozens and dozens and dozens, maybe well over 100, 150, maybe 200 Tory MPs who, if they don't admit it to you on broadcast, if they don't admit it on the doorstep, they need to start admitting it to themselves, as I did, from about 1995 onwards. I knew I was on death row from 1995 counter-council elections until the day that I was actually defeated.
Did you say that on the equivalent of this programme at the time?
No, I didn't. Right up until 1 minute to 10 o'clock at the close of polls, I was still saying to my party workers and all the rest of the press, one more heave and we're going to pull it off tonight. But I knew myself for 2 years that I was going to lose.
And it's a horrible thing, isn't it? I had that when I was a candidate. I knew from the February before the election in June, or was it June or May, that I was going to lose, but I couldn't admit it to anybody apart from my partner and my dogs.
And there are far more Tory MPs this time round who will be going through that emotion. If you're the newly elected MP, stick to my part of the world, the newly elected MP last time round for Scunthorpe, the newly elected Tory MP for Grimsby, we had Austin Mitchell and Anthony Crossland and umpteen Labour MPs for nearly a century before, they must know, if they admit it to themselves, I don't ever expect them to do anything other than to knock on the doors and saying it's all going to come right on the night. Of course, I did the same. But in the dark watches of the night, when they go to bed, they must know that they have got at most 26 months left.
Charlotte, you're not a party political animal. I think you would self-describe as on the left. Do you take any delight from this, the fact that the question's even been asked, let alone what the answer is?
Well, the Tory party's expired, hasn't it?
It has ceased to be.
It's more than that.
It's the end of the party as we know it.
Yep.
And I hope that Keir Starmer wins at the next election. Of course I do.
That doesn't come as a great shock to any of us that you hope that. But isn't it bad for democracy when one of the two major parties that's been at the centre of British political power for centuries and is seen as the most successful political party in the world in terms of winning elections, that it has got to this state?
It has. And I mean, to be fair to Liz Truss, I mean, she didn't inherit, did she, an awful lot from Boris Johnson. The party had already been heavily discredited, quite rightly so, I think, through various lies that had been told, court cases, in fact, that had been brought and were successful on behalf of the Good Law Project and others, holding the government to account. So
she just defeated your argument by mentioning the Good Law Project.
Oh, Iain. No, look, she really inherited, didn't she, a poison chalice. So I think that she has an uphill struggle. And then, of course, with the U-turn on taxes as well, she really has to win back the trust.
But she did inherit a sort of near enough 80-seat majority, which any Prime Minister would love to inherit.
Yeah,
and yet that seems to be squandered already with the benefits situation. It looks as if there are enough Tory MPs to defeat their own government on that.
Yeah, but I mean, look at the damage that was already caused by Boris Johnson in partying during lockdowns, being fined by the government. So she'd already inherited, I think, such a horrendous situation within her own party internally. And then, of course, it seems as if she's lost the trust of those people around her, from her own ministers. So, I mean, how she's going to win that back, I don't know. And judging by her speech today, certainly didn't instill me with a lot of confidence. And I suspect for many people that were watching that. And, you know, the whole levelling up agenda I thought was so important, particularly from someone who comes from the north. And I think that resonated as well with a lot of people when Boris Johnson had committed to that. And I didn't see very much of that resonating in Liz Truss's speech. And so I think that the traditional Labour Party voters that voted Tory at the last election, I think will be won over perhaps by Keir Starmer.
Well, there was a poll out today that showed 61% Labour in the red wall seats.
But we'll see whether actually Labour win a majority. It may be a coalition. Maybe a coalition with the Lib Dems, who knows?
I doubt that very much. My 2C.
And because of the system that we have, parties in government, there's no, it's not term limited. Usually you go out based on two reasons. One is when you're just basically tired. You become a dinosaur. That's 97 major, or the 90s. Or you're not taken seriously anymore. And the reason I say that rather than saying incompetence or trust is because it's a combination of incompetence and not being trusted. That's when it's more closer to 2010 Gordon Brown. But you can't keep going forward and survive. Usually, if you still offer something, that's, whether you like it or not, 80s was that, or 97 to 2007 Blair was that. The problem with the Tories now is it's not the 1990s Tories. It's not that, oh, they've done everything now it's just tired. It's not dying in that sense. The body of the party doesn't exist anymore because they've been so all over the place. They survived not by keep offering new things since 2010, but they did it based on plasters. Every time, 2015, they renewed the party in government, basically. The coalition's gone. Now they become a majority. Then 2017 or 2019, now it's the Brexit Britain party. So it keeps changing the party too much that, it's completely changing what the party is and what the MPs are, what the members are. So the 2019 voters and the 2019 Tory MPs up there, they are very different, their priorities, to the sorry ones, let alone to the actual Essex ones. So there's no actual vision, let alone unity.
It's like off Essex. Manera.
Well, I think Charlotte and Michael here already said it. I mean, the sell-by date is long past. They've gone mouldy and they need chucking out, is what I would say to you. Of course, they're past their sell-by date, as we already discussed in the previous question. There's lots of traditional and new Tory voters who just feel let down, taken for granted. And I think, with under Johnson, we had the breakdown of integrity and constant undermining of Parliament, lying to Parliament, and putting cronies in the House of Lords and in all sorts of other positions. So you've had that sort of undermining of integrity, and when the vast majority of the public playing by the rules, Tory ministers felt that they didn't have to. And now, under Truss, and I would say this already started under Johnson, complete and utter incompetence, that, she's only been in 4 weeks, and the price that people are paying through higher mortgage rates, and seeing that she just wants to give tax cuts to the wealthy and big business and hang people who are vulnerable and on benefits.
Why are the Liberal Democrats not benefiting from this at all? Your poll ratings are still the same as they were a month, 2 months, 5 months, 10 months ago.
Look, Iain, you've been around politics a long time. You and I both know that what's going on in the ground in particular constituencies, which we're fighting to win at the next election, doesn't always translate through to polls. And don't forget, our own party conference had to be cancelled because of the sad death of the Queen, and so we didn't get the additional publicity that each of the parties gets through this.
So that's why we were keen to have you on today.
So you're not voting for the country, just some seats, are you saying? So you're not voting for all the seats?
Well, I mean, sadly, unless you want me to now go into a whole whole rant
Strategy.
about
No,
the
don't.
need for proportional representation.
No, I really don't.
I didn't think you would.
We did a phone-in on that last week,
I
believe it
agree
or
with
not.
you. We should have
But
proportional
look, under first
representation.
past the post, the reality is, and the reality has always been, that each party targets their resources on the seats that they can win. And if you look at most of the seats where we're in a strong second place, it's largely in that blue wall. It's Conservative facing. And frankly, I think based on the current polls, whatever it says at a national level, I think people like Dominic Raab down the road from me in Isha and Walton, Stephen Hammond in Wimbledon, also down the road, should all, people like them, Steve Bryan in Winchester and elsewhere across the country, Guildford, Hazel
Okay,
Grove,
let's
Cheadle,
not
they should
go
all be
through
looking
the whole
over.
lot.
But I'm saying they should all be looking over their shoulder, and they should be very, very worried indeed. And maybe they feel like they're on death row like you were, Michael, in 1995.
Just briefly, Munir is absolutely right.
Yeah.
Every political party, especially a smaller party, is obviously going to concentrate its resources on the seats, looking back in history, that it knows it has a very good chance of winning. Labour people will vote for your candidates in the seats that you mentioned. But can I just follow up on a point that Charlotte hinted at? The reason that we're in this mess is because when the House of Commons meets next Monday, when when Liz Truss gets up at Prime Minister's Questions on Wednesday, she's going to look behind her and needs to recognise that 244 out of the 357 Tory MPs did not want her to be Prime
it was
Minister.
worse than that. It was 320 of them, because she only got 50 votes in the first round.
Well, I'm being kind
I know
and
you
going
are.
to the
I'm
final
not.
round. But the point is, what this shows is that you can never constitutionally have a Prime Minister that does not command the confidence of their party in government. And the Tories in government are going to have to ensure that the next time, and it could be before the next election, perish the thought, the next time round they're going to have to restrict it to members of Parliament. And I just don't think that she has any authority, because
That's a very difficult one, isn't it? Because once you've given party members a vote, it's very difficult to take it away from them again.
Well, I think the Tory party members in the country will recognise that they may well have made a mistake, and they might be only too happy for their own members of Parliament to try and save their skins that way.
There has to be a leadership election when the party is in power,
government.
Yes.
rather than in opposition.
Yeah.
Maybe that.
That was the way we did it. Well, I actually had a vote in 1990 where there were three names: Major, Heseltine, and Hurd, and I put my cross against a particular candidate, as the others did,
Don't be
and we
coy.
arrived at I voted for Michael Heseltine.
Did you really?
I
Oh,
did.
God.
Yes.
Traitors.
Even
the memory of Lady Thatcher.
Well, I think if he was young enough, he would do a better job running the government today if he was still available, and he'd probably
Even I would have
give
to
it a
admit
fighting
that.
chance than the Tory party as it's currently led.
Even Iain doesn't agree.
Well, yeah. Anyway, let's finish this half of the programme with a lovely text about Charlotte. It says, I'm only listening to hear Dr. Proudman. She's doing a fantastic job for women. I'm an adult survivor of childhood abuse and domestic violence, and at 46 years old, I'm still affected by the violence that I saw against my mum.
Oh, thank you. That's really, really generous and kind.
Makes a
of you.
change from some of the
Thank you.
texts and tweets we get when people... And you're
Same for
I should
me.
say Charlotte's sitting in the seat where she can actually see the text
Yes,
screen, which is always I'm never sure whether that's a good idea sometimes, depending on who the panellist
I
is.
enjoy seeing the comments to you, Ian. They're my favourite.
Right, we will take more of your questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call, and you can text 84850. I hope that whoever sent that text in, I hope you'll love the programme so much that you'll keep listening, even when Charlotte isn't on. It's 29 minutes to 9. Let's get the news headlines from Andy Ivey.
The Prime Minister has criticised what she's called the anti-growth coalition in her speech to the Conservative Party conference. Liz Truss attacked opponents of her economic plans, including Labour, unions and environmental activists who interrupted her address. A man's been jailed for 15 years for causing a gas explosion which killed a toddler when he cut pipes to sell them for scrap metal. The blast at Heysham in Lancashire last year damaged a total of 55 properties. Mortgage rates have hit their highest level in 14 years. Moneyfacts says the average 2-year fixed-rate home loan is now at more than 6% for the first time since November 2008. LBC weather: showers becoming confined to the north and northwest overnight. Tomorrow, cloudy and windy with showers across central and northern areas. The best of the dry weather in the south and east. A high of 19 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:34. Christopher in Banbury says, Iain, you and your panel are coming across as a bunch of hysterical hyenas. Get a grip. The general election is 2 years away. This is politics. Popularity goes up and it goes down. Keir Starmer is far from safely holding the key to number 10 in his duplicitous hands. Northern Labour voters will never forgive Starmer for his stance on a second Brexit vote or for supporting Jeremy Corbyn as a Prime Minister. Do not discount the return of Nigel. Da, da, da.
Why are you looking at me?
I don't know why I'm looking at you. Sorry. Right, our panel is Munira Wilson from the Liberal Democrats, Michael Brown, former Conservative MP, Dr. Charlotte Proudman, human rights barrister, and Maya Tusi, the political YouTuber. Our next question is a text question from Tracy in Brockley. After Liz Truss took aim at them during her speech today, do the panel think there are too many think tanks? Maya?
Yes, I've been talking about this for a while now on my YouTube channel because there was this discussion a few decades ago about the Tories were calling there are too many trade unions. You know, they're all basically representing the same industries. But at least there's a membership for trade unions, and it's like representative. There are way too many think tanks. There are way too many. Well, it's all groupthink. But it's not really anything original. That's my problem.
Are you talking about on the right or the left or both?
We've had both, but primarily the very centre-right and centre-left, because these days, whether you like it or not, but mainstream, when I say centre-right, centre-left, so you get the types of IEA and ASI, the Adam Smith Institute and those guys, they used to be on the outside. Even until David Cameron days, even when you used to go to Tory conference, they used to have a tent outside. But they've been inside. They are mainstream now, and there are way too many, and they're all saying the exact same thing, or talking about so many niche stuff that is, to be fair, that's more out of touch than a random MP in Parliament, who's being accused of being out of touch. That's what we always say. Us YouTubers would say, "Oh, MPs are out of touch." That's the usual rhetoric, but actually, it's mostly anybody else in the Westminster bubble, all the think tanks, all the people who, also pressure groups and advocate groups and all these advocacy groups, they don't really know about the reality of what's happening, not just in the Red Wall, but you're in inner cities.
But surely the whole point of think tanks is to think the unthinkable. There's a book on think tanks.
Yeah, but they don't.
They're not doing
that. That's the problem. That's that they're not doing that. They used to do that.
Maya's absolutely
it was
right.
the types of the likes of Hayek and Friedman that created the likes of Thatcher. Whether you agree or disagree with the views, obviously, but like for example, Truss or anyone new politician-wise, they're not the creator of any original ideas, and it's just sad. It's quite damaging to the future of the country because everything's become reactionary rather than being proactive.
Okay, Munira, is this a problem you have with the Liberal Democrats? Too many think tanks? I can think of two.
Too few.
Not in the slightest. I think the issue is, what do politicians do with what comes out of think tanks as opposed to the existence of think tanks altogether? And, I was really alarmed when I saw Tim, after the mini-budget, Tim Montgomery, the Conservative commentator, put out what I felt was quite a sinister tweet when he said that the IEA, the Institute for Economic Affairs, had sort of incubated, I think was a word he used, both Truss and Kwarteng since they became MPs, and now the nation and the economy is a petri dish, is a lab for their ideas, and so this idea that politicians should just get in with one think tank and then, as you say, think tanks are there to think the unthinkable, and they are often in ivory towers. So I think actually responsible politicians need to be looking to think tanks to get ideas, and you talked about pressure groups and whatnot, but they often have expertise, and and companies and other organisations will come and give their evidence to politicians, and it's up to us to look at that critically and think about what is good and right for the country, and also what is practical and can be put into effect. And what we've seen with Truss and Kwarteng is that they've taken a fairly pure ideology and just applied it neat, really. It's like a double shot of of a very strong spirit without actually looking at what the ramifications will be on all sections of society.
Just on that, the Newsagents podcast actually looks at this. I think the episode yesterday where they interviewed Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute for Economic Affairs, and sort of try to get to the bottom of what influence his organisation has on the government. Now, Michael Brown, you and I remember in the 70s and 80s, the IEA was very influential influential on Margaret Thatcher. A lot of the policies that they promulgated were adopted by the Thatcher government. But in those days, it was always seen as a positive thing, whereas nowadays it's seen as a negative thing.
Well, I can go back even slightly further than that. I got interested in joining and subscribing to the Institute of Economic Affairs in the early 70s when Ted Heath was going off the rails, following some of the policies that we've got at the moment, printing money, the Barber budget and all the rest of it. And I thought the Conservative Party was corporatist. I was a young idealist. And I got introduced to Ralph Harris, one of the predecessors of the current director, Mark Littlewood. And they were regarded by the Conservative Party as absolutely off the wall. But it was Margaret Thatcher that did occasionally, more than occasionally, listen to them. But they should be at the edges. They shouldn't be part of the establishment. And I agree absolutely with Maya that too many of these think tanks have now become establishment, and they do get on my nerves a bit. The Resolution Foundation, which has our friend David Willits on the one hand, and that fellow who used to work for Ed Miliband, who's always called up by the BBC. I do get irritated by that. But I think they should be thinking the unthinkable. Politicians in cabinet should keep them at arm's length. But young sprogs like me and Michael Portillo and Michael Forsyth and all that gang in the late 70s and early 80s did use the IEA to put some pressure on Margaret Thatcher in the days when she was being pulled in the opposite direction.
Charlotte, briefly, if we can.
I must say, I do love a think tank. I really like IPPR.
Weird.
They do a lot of amazing work. They've interviewed me.
They're on your sort of wavelength.
No, but I find the research really important. They looked, for example, at no recourse to public funds for migrant women that don't have access to public benefits, and particularly those who experience domestic abuse and living on the outside of society. So they not only look at the impact upon marginalised groups, for instance, but come up with ideas of how to address that through policy or legislation. And I'd just say, this notion about, well, we need to think the unthinkable, whether it's through think tanks or it's through pressure groups. We did have that. We had that with Momentum, and we had that with Jeremy Corbyn. And people didn't like that. People didn't vote for it. Jeremy Corbyn came up with the unthinkable of having a 3-day working week. People didn't vote for it.
4-day, I think.
I don't think people dislike the unthinkable concept. I think they just dislike the ideas coming out of it, not the fact that it was unthinkable. Because I'm glad you said that, because I was going to use Momentum as an example, as a good example. We could disagree with the direction and the ideas.
It doesn't exist anymore, does it, though? That's
but we don't have that anymore.
No, we don't. There's a real gap. But also they were heavily criticised for coming up with radical policies or radical ideas. I'm not saying that we need to adopt all of those, but like you say, it's important to have that conversation.
I think that's the biggest issue.
Debate. And that's just not happening now.
That's the tiny bit, because while I used to kind of praise the concept, but that's also the problem, because we've put a lid on any unthinkable concept or new ideas, that when you open it, it will be Trussism or Momentum. It's kind of like out of control. So, but if you you're right, if you start to adapt it more regularly and more moderately, and listen to, as you say, multiple think tanks and politicians to have critical thinking, because even Margaret Thatcher, I can imagine, she was listening to them, but also trying to actually agree with it in her own head, rather than certain politicians now who just say, oh, just give me the report, I'll just do it.
Perish the thought that anyone should think the unthinkable about the NHS, though, because the moment a think tank, whether it's the right or left, sort of tries to challenge conventional wisdom on how the NHS should be. Oh, you want to privatise it, even though the word privatisation might not even appear.
It's a sacred institution, isn't it, though, when it comes to the NHS? Yeah. And I think we've learned, haven't we, through COVID, that everybody loves, respects, values the NHS.
I mean, Charles Moore was on this programme, was it last week or the week before, and had the temerity to question whether the NHS was being run in the right way. Yeah. And digital people put out a clip. My Twitter feed was unreadable for 2 days.
Did it get cancelled, basically? Yeah, you'll be cancelled.
It was cancelled from Cross Question.
I know. You can't even say it, that's the problem.
No, I can hereby reveal that Charles Moore will never be cancelled on Cross Question, not while I'm in the seat anyway. Right, we'll take more of your questions in a moment. It's coming up to 8:45.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Conservative MP and Foreign Secretary James Cleverly. When the energy companies themselves say they should be taxed more to help struggling households, why won't you and your colleagues review the idea of a windfall tax?
If the heads of these big companies want to make decisions on what they do with their money, that's great.
They're ready to say it. Why don't you pick up the phone to Kwasi and say, come on, let's get that windfall tax?
Because the windfall tax figures that most people are talking about are not taxable because they are not UK figures.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With Motorway, where dealers compete to give you their best price for your car.
LBC. Day. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:47, Munira Wilson, Michael Brown, Charlotte Proudman and Maya Tusi with me in the studio answering your questions. I've got one. I don't normally put questions to one panellist, but just very briefly, Charlotte, this one's directed at you. Joanne in Birmingham says, what is Dr. Charlotte's view on how the two Greenpeace ladies were removed at the conference today? I watched it and thought the way that the security person yanked the lanyard from the poor girl's neck was definitely a criminal assault. All immature Truss could say was get rid of them. What a disgrace. That is a disgrace, as she might have said. Just shows how far and heavy Truss and her crew will go. Far be it from me to pass judgment on any protester, given an incident in my past, which we don't need to go into. This is very difficult, isn't it? Because if someone stands up in the middle of a speech like that, clearly the security people have got to remove them somehow. I mean, what does the law say on this? And I mean, is Joanne right when she says she thought it was heavy-handed? I mean, I was sitting in the hall. I saw it all happen. It happened quite quickly, actually, and it didn't seem to me that there was a sort of overuse of force. But what was your view?
To be honest, I haven't watched the clip in slow motion, so I think it's difficult for me to pass comment. I don't want to pass comment.
I was hoping you'd be a VAR person.
As a barrister in this capacity. But what I can say from a personal perspective is that often I think more force can be used when it comes to escorting or exiting women out of venues. And it reminds me of that situation that happened where a woman she was protesting at an event and a MP came to grab her by the throat.
Mark Field.
Yes. And I remember, in fact, I can see the image now when I was watching the video, and I was absolutely horrified by the way that this woman was treated. And nobody said anything. Nobody intervened even. And then, of course, there was an uproar on Twitter, the space for moral opinion.
It was at the Lord Mayor's banquet, wasn't it?
It was,
Yeah.
and I thought it was absolutely disgraceful. And it's an example, I think, of more force sometimes being used excessively when it comes to women protesting as opposed to men. It's more expected of men to protest and to engage in political debate or exercise their rights in this way, in contrast to women.
Having said that, I have a long enough memory you might have even been there as well, at Tory conferences when you've got a Prime Minister in the particular location, going back to 1984, when I lost several of my colleagues to the terrorism. Having said all of that, by the way, the woman today was smiling broadly as she was escorted out.
And
she was very happy with the publicity she
we
got.
should make clear, actually wasn't a security guard that yanked the lanyard
I was going to say,
off. It was one of the Tory representatives.
Yeah, I was going to clarify, it was a Tory member that did the lanyard. Not
Sheila, if you want to go back and listen, Sheila covered this in a lot of detail this afternoon on her programme. Right, let's go to a text question from Julian Bermondsey. A video from a school in Iran today shows a military leader being heckled by brave and brilliant schoolgirls. Is the oppressive regime going to be toppled by women and girls? I mean, that would be quite something if it happened. We covered this last Thursday on the show. We did an hour-long phone-in with somebody who's a member of the Iranian parliament in exile in the studio with me. And I've had lots of emails since then and texts or tweets from people saying, well, thank you for covering this because it isn't being covered enough in the UK media. And then some people who clearly didn't know that we did it complaining that we hadn't covered it. So you can never win. Maya, I'm coming to you first on this, and I'm going to give you the lion's share of the time on this because you are from Iran originally.
Yes, and my mother was a political refugee, and I've got, obviously I can't name them, but I've got very close relatives who are still stuck in Iran under house arrest, and it's a very interesting situation because there is a difference, and people keep asking me, oh, do you think this is it? Or is it going to be crushed again? Without going with blind optimism, it is at least the beginning of the end. And the number of reasons that I can actually list, one of the main ones is before, coincidentally, every 10 years you've had a movement in Iran. For some reason, it was always every 10 years. And it was mostly led by educated students, younger people, and men. And also just middle class. And it still matters, but there were a lot of important issues. You know, there was a newspaper that was shut down. There was an election that was rigged. But now, this movement that you see did not start 2 weeks ago because of a 22-year-old woman who got killed. It wasn't that. That was just a spark that was needed after the long pause since COVID. This started in 2019. This is a cost of living uprising. This time you have the poor, the rich, the young, old, man, woman, and now there's something new over the past couple of weeks. And as you mentioned, there's school kids and mostly also women. It's not just that they're out, it's the way they're fighting. The fact that the Masal Amini, the 20-year-old woman who got killed, arrested and got killed because of not really wearing the headscarf properly, yet now you're saying women, younger women, older women, going on the streets, taking off their headscarves and burning them. The reason it's different is because in the past, all the other movements that happened previously, the regime had a very easy tactic. They go out there, they shoot a couple of people, and the rest just disappear. People just run away, because the Iranians are not revolutionary people. So that used to happen. Now, the fact that school children are coming out, school children...
this isn't the only incident, is it?
No, it's literally almost all schools from various cities. And that's the other thing. It's literally every single big city and town and some random villages. It's also so out of control that we're not seeing much from the regime. There's not much actually visibly. They've always been very careful not to give too much evidence to the West. Even if someone gets killed, they say, Mossad came and killed them, to blame it on us. But this time, even the videos that you see comparing the past, the actual Revolutionary Guard, the security forces, they're not that visible. They're not. Of course, there are certain bits, some like to the west of Iran, some villages that there are not more like cameras or anything. There's a bit of a massacre situation, but generally speaking, in big cities that people are filming, they're not doing anything too much that they could. The regime, and there are a lot of theories around it. They're kind of losing the leadership, the kind of the actual consensus, the fact that they've lost the poor, the religious people from small towns that they took it for granted until now, and now people have nothing to lose. They are literally walking towards the security forces and saying, "Shoot." I can't afford my food anymore. I can't afford, my rent. I don't care if I die. So the regime are kind of like speechless. And we are now also seeing a lot of defections from the armed forces, the police, and they keep posting on Instagram, Twitter with their membership cards, burning them, saying we are now kind of defecting to the revolution. And one of the reasons that I hope continues is, of course, we have to be the voice, or obviously voluntarily in the West, and no one has to be, but we have to be their voice to kind of give them the coverage they deserve. But they don't want foreign intervention. They just say, just trust us, we'll do it ourselves, because they don't want to.
But why is it, do you think, that the international media aren't covering this to the extent that you think they probably ought to? I mean, funny enough, when I saw that question, I was looking at the Sky News screen and they were actually covering it. But that's because there's a video of these schoolgirls revolting.
Yes, yeah.
And if you haven't got, for a television different for radio, but for a television organisation, if you ain't got the pictures, you probably don't cover it.
Yeah, I mean, if you go with the extreme kind of theories that then people say, well, clearly there's not much kind of vested interest into a potential revolution in Iran. So the donors of the media are not really, or the people who lobby, they're not going to push for it. But there's also a logical reason, especially for the organizations like the BBC. It's difficult to verify stories. It's because media is so bureaucratic here that, you can't just, even if you show a clip, it's still not enough evidence. Because if they don't have anybody on the ground, how do you actually verify it? We know it's happening, but a BBC broadcaster can't really just say it's definitely this video is from today from this school, and so that's the best kind of excuse. But I think they feel like there's a lack of appetite, and maybe there has been in terms of what should we care about people in Iran comparing to like Ukraine, because there must be there is probably more of a kind of interest when it comes to Ukraine, because
Iran isn't actually that far from Ukraine, is it?
No,
that's the thing.
And actually, there are political reasons that we should be interested, because if you sort out Iran, not by intervening, but actually by hoping that it gets sorted, and you could actually have Iran and Israel as the main allies. And you can actually sort out a lot of problems in the Middle East. The Hamas and Hezbollah won't be funded anymore, and Jeremy Corbyn will lose his job on the state TV. So that's
right.
Good news.
Charlotte, I want to hear from you on this, because this is the ultimate sort of depiction of women exerting power and influence, or at least influence at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly empowering image to see women and girls standing up to a highly oppressive, patriarchal regime in this way, with girls burning their hijabs, women cutting their hair and filming this, which is an incredibly visceral act, to take scissors to your hair, to actually cut it off. You'd rather do that than continue living in the society in which you're subjugated on a daily basis. The idea that women and girls can bring down this regime, I think, is incredible, and I actually think it's possible as well. I mean, they are 51% of the population. Why not?
Why is it in this country, though, that feminists have been rather reluctant to enter this debate about the burqa, the hijab, whatever? Because the thinking is, well, it is a symbol of repression, and yet feminists in this country think, well, no, it isn't actually, that women choose to wear. Now, I'm sure there are many that do.
Yes.
I think the reason is because it's not for me as a white Western woman to tell another woman what she should and shouldn't do, particularly
even if she's being oppressed.
Well, if she's being oppressed, of course, that's a completely different matter, and I represent women that have been oppressed and have been forced and coerced to wear burqas or to wear hijabs, and it's a real issue, and it's one that we do need to address. And I think people are very shy and reluctant of getting involved, and I'm one of those people, because for some people it is an important religious and cultural identity issue for them, and it's not for me to tell them what they should and shouldn't do with their bodies. And that's the point, isn't it? This is why this woman ended up being arrested by the moral police, because she was being told that she wasn't wearing her hijab in the right way. Why should we then tell women and girls, you can't wear a hijab?
I guess
it's for them to decide.
That if a woman in this country is being oppressed and forced by her husband to wear whatever, she's never going to say to you, I'm being oppressed, because she probably daren't say to anyone that
But
she's
that's
being
the same,
oppressed.
isn't it, with coercive and controlling behaviour? I mean, for any woman and girl that is experiencing that, or if you know women and girls are experiencing it, I'm here to tell you that is domestic abuse, and it's a form of coercive and controlling behaviour.
Just a quick point. The issue of the collective Western feminists, of course, are individuals. You guys will be defending the rights of Iranian women. The issue is not for them to actually, we don't need the Western feminists to come out and debate the hijab thing. It's that the collective Western liberals, feminists, are not even brave enough to just say, I stand with the Iranian women who are burning their hijabs.
Oh, gosh, I do.
That's the problem.
I can
what
tell
happened to the
you.
celebrities in Hollywood who do all the hashtags? They're not doing it now.
Well, they should be.
Exactly.
They should be standing with them, and I stand with them. And I say, if you want to burn your hijab, you burn it. It's about free choice
and
a right to be able to do that. And it's about
important.
living in a society where you can do that.
Yep.
This is incredibly important for the sort of wider Iranian diaspora around the world. One of my colleagues at LBC has a similar background to you, and he came. Going to get emotional now. He came up to us earlier and thanked us for doing that hour last week because it meant so much to him. Munira.
Well, I agree with a lot of the comments that have already been made. I think the women in Iran, the women and girls, are being incredibly courageous. It's inspirational what they're doing, and I do absolutely stand with them. And I'd like us to follow the US and Canada in sanctioning the morality police, because we haven't done that yet. I think in terms of the lack of focus, that's also partly because of the lack of political focus in this country, because clearly we've had a government that's been very distracted.
Yes.
And I think that maybe when we're back in Parliament next week and there is more discussion about it, then we might get more coverage on this issue. And
ask a question at PMQs.
Yeah, raise it.
Yeah.
I know your education space, so it doesn't matter.
It's whether I can get in. I think there's already 3 Lib Dems on the ballot.
We're
but on the
running out of
hijab,
time.
I'd just like to say it is a matter of choice, and I don't think it's for us to say whether
Michael, we're running out of time
briefly.
Okay, just very briefly, Iain, just occasionally, sometimes, velvet revolutions do work. I'm thinking of the fall of Ceausescu, the Velvet Revolution in several other of the Eastern European countries that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Let's keep our fingers crossed.
Yes.
Now, final text question from Kevin in Oxfordshire. Liz Truss was ushered into today's leader's speech to the music of M People, Moving On Up. What would the panel's choice of music be to be ushered out of the LBC studios tonight to? And if Corey has got his fingers at the ready, we might even do it if you suggest something that is appropriate. Corey says no. Maya?
Well, mine is always my favourite 60s song, Mary Hopkins, and Those Were the Days. Those were the days,
Mary
my
Hopkins
friends.
follows me on Twitter and has DM'd me. Isn't that wonderful? Mary Hopkins, I
That's
should
amazing.
say.
Hopkins, yeah.
Jealous. Everyone wants to rule the world. I feel like that. I'm dedicating that to you, Iain, actually.
I don't want to rule the world.
You're ruling LBC.
Okay, Munira.
Change is going to come.
Oh, God. I don't like that.
Michael?
Good night.
And good night to you. Thank you all very much indeed. That's Michael Brown, Munira Wilson, Charlotte Proudman and Maya Tousi. And where can we find you on YouTube? Just search
It's just
your
my
name.
full name, Maya Tousi.
Nobody can spell it, but Mahyartousi. In a moment, we're going to... Well, let me put this to you. If you were on your deathbed and a nurse came up to you and said, could I have your voting intention, please, before we decide if we're going to resuscitate you, what would you think? 0345 6060 973. It's 2 minutes past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Liz Truss has attacked what she called the anti-growth coalition during her party conference speech. The Prime Minister blamed Labour, unions and Brexit deniers for holding back her pro-growth agenda. The speech in Birmingham was